Chapter 9 Chosen by Destiny.
I just don't understand how they knew.
Thelma vigorously wiped down the dining room tables, a nervous habit she tended to use to cope.
I thought they had given up searching for you after their last attack.
Zelda sat in a chair, watching Thelma bustle around the room. The woman was not one to sit still for very long.
I'm not sure either, but it doesn't matter. They know.
The Sheikah elder, Vernia, had begun an investigation into it all. She was devastated about Impa's kidnapping and was not going to stand back and do nothing. She'd already told Zelda that she had a lead, but would not reveal it yet, claiming she wanted to be absolutely certain. Thelma paused and took a long look at the princess.
We should send a few guards with you. No, the fewer souls the better. But dear,
She struggled to keep back tears.
you've already been through so much. You've just returned.
Zelda stood and embraced her.
I love you too, Thelma. But I must go. Don't worry.
She released her and squeezed her arms.
Rovin will be with me.
He had quite literally begged to come along. Rescuing Impa was a challenge for which she was not fully prepared, and was the only reason she'd agreed. Thelma had insisted that they take the night to rest up, and in an hour's time, they would be on their way. Not that Zelda had gotten any sleep. So much had been lost. She felt that everything she'd done up until now was for nothing if Impa did not survive this. Her heart felt empty, and she knew Rovin could see it. She could tell he was worried for her, so she'd been putting on a brave face for both him and Thelma. They were undeniably good friends, looking out for her, encouraging her to talk about Garen's death, but it felt so much harder without Impa here. So she squared her shoulders and cleared her mind of distractions, just as Impa would have instructed her to do. She focused on planning this rescue mission instead of wallowing in feelings she did not want to face. Whether this was a healthy tactic, well, that was another story.
Where is that boy? He's taking his time, isn't he?
Thelma complained. As though on cue, Rovin stumbled into the inn's dining area, hauling too many supplies for the trip ahead. Weapons and loaves of bread spilling onto the floor. Zelda sighed.
Rovin, we can't bring all this.
She said, helping him clean up. Oh. He avoided her eyes, something he'd been doing since she returned. They hadn't spoken about their last encounter before she'd left, and she hoped they wouldn't. She didn't know what she would say anyway. Sorry I used you for my own comfort and sadness? How could she admit that out loud? Thelma rushed over to help.
Let me organize your pack, Rovin. You and Zelda go sit and rest.
It was not a request. They obliged, and Rovin anxiously drummed his fingers on the table and bounced a knee, while Zelda sat perfectly still, watching him.
We're going to find her,
She assured him.
I won't return without Impa.
He gave her a weak smile, but his nervousness was overtaking him, she could tell. Zelda thought for a moment, and then took out the compass, placing it gently on the table between them. Rovin stilled and stared at it, then finally looked her in the eyes, his own welling up slightly.
Thank you for trusting me with it.
She said.
Though the only time I had to use it was in a desert that kept magically whisking me back to the entrance.
She smirked at him, hoping the humor would make him feel better. That's how he always approached her lack of confidence. So perhaps she could give back. He let out a soft laugh. That's the only thing you've told me about your journey. It was true. She hadn't really let anyone in on what she'd gone through. There wasn't much time, for one thing. And for another, she wasn't really sure how to talk about it.
I'll fill you in more on our way to Gerudo Valley,
She promised.
But be warned, there's a lot to tell.
I can't wait, he replied, his eyes bright with mischief like she was used to. When Thelma finished, she insisted they each eat a filling lunch before departing, and hugged them both too tightly, sending them on their way with worried eyes. At the stable, Rovin noted Milana's absence. In fact, Zelda hadn't seen her at all since she returned. She couldn't say she wasn't relieved at that. They left Kageno on Kami's back, Rovin straddled behind Zelda and clutching her for dear life. He wasn't used to riding, which meant they'd have to make more stops than she would like. But they were finally on their way, and her determination deepened. They would rescue Impa. They would bring her home. And if she had to, Zelda would give up everything she had worked toward to do it. The normally 2-day trek took 3 instead. Rovin's exhaustion caught up to him, and he almost fell off the horse at a high speed. So they stopped for the night. They sat near a fire, warming their hands. The weather was beginning to turn, the nights becoming colder, and while it was a bit of an inconvenience to have to look after someone else, Zelda was glad she wasn't alone this time. "It must be hard to be back out here so soon," Rovin said, breaking the awkward silence. She responded with a wry smile. He had no idea. "Did you meet anyone interesting?"
Yes.
She replied, smiling at the memories.
There was a potion maker who could see right through my disguise, a gravekeeper who gave me life advice, a silly fairy who guided me through the forest, and of course, the sages. Each of them powerful. Each of them full of promise.
Rovin frowned. "And they were all murdered," he said. "Zelda, I'm sorry. That must have been impossible." It felt good to be seen like that, her sorrows recognized as valid. She'd had to wrestle with the feelings all on her own, pushing through the pain to get to where she needed to be, for Hyrule's sake, for their future, but it didn't make it any less terrible. And Rovin seeing that so clearly made her feel safer, understood, loved. He deserved answers. She glanced at him and cleared her throat.
Rovin, I need to explain myself to you. What I did, why I did it. It can't really be justified, but perhaps if you would allow me—
"Nothing you could do would make me hate you," he interrupted. "I don't need any explanation. I can see right through you, remember? I know what you were thinking. I know that you needed something in that moment. To help you. To keep you sane. And honestly, I did too." She blinked, taken aback.
You're not upset with me?
He smiled, his eyes kind and full of friendship. "Zelda, you're a person, not just a princess. Not just a warrior or a Sheikah in disguise. A person. I've told you for years, you never get to take a breath. And if I could allow a quiet opportunity for you to finally do that, I would. I will." He reached out a hand to her, and she grasped it without hesitation. "I'm here for you. Whatever that means." She didn't know what to say, so she simply held his hand for a while, and they stared into the fire together. She didn't deserve this treatment. Rovin, like Rauru, viewed her as some kind of pure soul, but she was selfish. Dark Sheik had literally mirrored the evil in her heart, according to Ryuta. So many could have survived this war of death and destruction if she had simply found a way to stop Ganondorf's plans before they even began. From the very beginning, she had made mistakes, and she had brought all of these people into her circle of doom. Those old familiar feelings of hopelessness crept in again, but she forced them away. She had to focus. At least, she still had friends. They lay down to get a few hours of sleep, but her mind would not shut off. Why did she resist it so much? The potential of a relationship, of being with someone who felt unconditionally for her, it had always felt like too much. too soon, too sensical. And though Zelda thrived on things making sense, this was the one aspect of her life that she could not rationalize. Part of it was her guilt, but was it also Link? She'd fallen for him as a child, wholeheartedly. She'd admitted that to herself long before now. But this was years ago. She'd been so young, and so many things had changed, not just in the world, but in her. Link would awaken with the mind of a child. Years of missing out on a full life that would have matured and taught him. The two of them would exist on opposite ends of a spectrum, and she doubted they could relate to each other anymore. Yet he still remained with her, in her very soul. Even though Rovin had actually been there, even though he had grown up with her, it was a paradox that she could not puzzle through. And as sleep took her, finally, the two heroes fought for space in her heart. It had been a while since she'd seen the sacred realm, but it looked exactly the same, as did Rauru, his owl-like eyes regarding her once again. "You did well, princess," he said, his usual serene smile gracing his face.
But Impa...
Impa is meant for a higher destiny. What did that mean? You must be the one to tell her that she is to be called. Wait, Impa was to become a sage? The ancient sages you met were destined to fall, and when the hero of time vanquishes the evil curses plaguing the temples, new sages must be called to their own destinies. Impa, indeed, is one of those sages. Zelda's heart ached. The sages had been viciously torn from their lives and their specialness. If it was so easy for Ganondorf to do, who was to say he couldn't do it again? Impa would be in danger as a sage, at risk. As shall all of them be. But without sages to protect the elemental magics that run through the veins of Hyrule, the lands will fall into a permanent darkness. No magic will remain, no connection. Every soul shall perish. Impa is part of a destiny that protects the land you call home. And you must tell her of this destiny, so that she may prepare. Zelda shook her head.
You mean, so that she can abandon us? So that she must sacrifice any future for herself that includes a family?
She thought of Vernia, their potential as a couple, their love. A sage's power lies in their ability to protect the people's right to a family. Sacrifice is a powerful force, one that a sage earns. They are champions, princess. Your hero of time has already made sacrifices in order to save Hyrule. As have you. As will you. She was a sage too, the seventh, guarding the Triforce of Wisdom. And Impa, she knew, would take the reins of destiny and gallop full throttle into the fire and shadows. Their paths were clear, and Zelda begrudgingly knew it was time to accept them. They waited until nightfall to sneak into the fortress. There were fewer Gerudo guards patrolling, and a better chance for them to make it to the prison cell that they'd spotted from the ground. Zelda had been surprised to note that the bridge into the valley had been broken. Only a gap remained, one large enough that they could not leap it on their own, but had to push Kami to her limit to jump across. They tied her off behind a boulder and had snuck to the entrance, getting the lay of the land. A guard paced close to them, and a torch lit the area. They'd have to figure out how to get around her, but Zelda could not see how. "We need to incapacitate her somehow," Rovin whispered. Zelda's mind immediately flashed to her test with Garen, when she'd gotten the best of his senses and surprised him. He'd been so proud of her, she could do it again.
Stay here,
she said. Rovin grasped her hand to keep her back, but she pulled it away, shaking her head and putting a finger to her lips. She mouthed the words, "Trust me," drew her scimitar, and silently and quickly moved toward the guard, who marched away from them. From behind the warrior woman, Zelda acted first, grabbing her, the scimitar to her throat, and pulling her into the darkness.
"Not a sound,"
she whispered harshly into the woman's ear, who smartly obeyed, dropping her own weapons when Zelda demanded it. Zelda whirled the guard around and pushed her up against a sandy wall, her weapon still pressed against her throat. The guard eyed them both, her gaze searing. Gerudo women were not used to being overpowered. Rovin rushed to retrieve the discarded weapons.
"We need you to get us to the prison cell,"
Zelda told her.
"Guide us there without alerting the guards, and I will let you live."
She hadn't taken a life, not yet, but in her heart, she knew she spoke the truth. She would eliminate this woman if she had to.
That will be difficult,
the guard replied.
"But not impossible,"
Zelda retorted.
If you're here on behalf of the princess, tell her to come on over and show her pretty face. If she does so, we'll release her oh-so-valued Sheik guardian.
Zelda pushed harder against the guard's throat, causing her to grunt.
"I am warning you now. Nothing will keep us from Impa. Not you, not your misguided people, and certainly not your ultimatums. Take us to the prison, or I will cut your throat and let you bleed out in the sand. No one will find you until dawn, and by then, the flies will already be swarming."
The guard's nostrils flared. Zelda was getting to her.
All right.
She submitted.
We'll need to hug the east wall and climb the fortress.
"Move."
Zelda pushed her in front of them, and she stumbled, full of fury. But she did as she was told, sticking to the wall and watchful of the other guards. They reached the fortress, and Zelda climbed first, then the guard, and then Rovin, keeping the Gerudo between them. She navigated over the fortress roof, leading them closer to the prison cell. As they did so, Zelda could hear a loud voice booming from it, a voice that raised the hair on her arms. She grabbed the guard's tunic and yanked her backward, throwing her to the ground, and pointed her weapon at her.
"How long has Ganondorf been here?"
She never expected him to come back to Gerudo Fortress, seeing as he'd taken over the castle and proclaimed himself King of Hyrule. She thought perhaps he'd let his Gerudo loyalists do his dirty work for him, but it seemed she'd been wrong. Rovin's jaw dropped. "He's here? Him?" Zelda had told him the stories of the King of Evil, each and every horrible thing he'd done. Rovin only had these tales to go off of, but now he would see exactly what Ganondorf was. It brought her no pleasure, but here they were. Someone else she cared for must confront the villain that was Ganondorf.
"How long?"
The guard smirked.
Long enough to leave poor Impa in shambles.
Zelda's heart dropped. It was a scenario she'd been trying to deny, but her fear was now realized. Ganondorf was torturing her. Zelda lost her focus for 1 second, but that was all it took. The guard bolted, leaping off the fortress roof and sprinting away. Rovin tried to run after her, but Zelda stopped him.
No, we need to get to Impa now.
He looked panicked but nodded, and they rushed forward toward the prison cell, where a whip could be heard lashing. Zelda winced as though she could feel it herself, but she heard no cries from Impa. A barred window, where Zelda and Rovin quietly watched, provided a view inside the cell, as Ganondorf paced back and forth before Impa, whose arms were chained to the wall, outstretched in a most uncomfortable way. Bloody gashes covered them, and Zelda had to stop herself from whimpering. All of this can stop, Sheikah. Just tell me where she's gone. Your stamina is inspiring, truly. But there is a time when all must give in. He leaned close to Impa's face. Sweat dripped down her temples, and she panted heavily, but said nothing. She looked him dead in his eyes, defiance radiating from her. He chuckled slowly. You and your people. You deign to reclaim a place that hates you. Your king is no more. He cannot protect you from those who would wish you dead. Kage knew it. He lifted a lock of hair from Impa's face, tucking it behind her ear, almost lovingly. She remained still. When I sliced his chest open, he knew it. He hid in that temple for years, pretending to love Hyrule. After everything that royal family did to your kind, you still wish to guard its princess? Zelda shook with fury. Kage. Impa finally opened her lips as if to say something, but instead, she spat into Ganondorf's eyes. He recoiled and smacked her across her face. Zelda moved to get up, but Rovin stilled her. Wiping his forehead, Ganondorf's lip curled, and a dangerous anger emanated from him. If you refuse to give me what I seek, then I suppose I shall have to open your chest as well. He stood, drawing a long blade from a sheath on his hip. Zelda tried to shout, a small noise escaping her, but Rovin covered her mouth with his hand and pulled her down below the barred window. One last chance, he told Impa, who remained defiantly silent. Zelda and Rovin slowly eased back up to look through the window again, and watched helplessly as Ganondorf raised his sword. The door to the prison cell burst open. An enchantingly beautiful Gerudo woman stood there, one that reminded Zelda of Suna, but she wasn't Suna at all.
Lord Ganondorf, why don't you allow me to take over the interrogation?
He snarled at her. You think you could do any better?
Sire, she's our only lead. Let me try. Besides, you're needed back at the castle. Kakariko residents are making waves again, begging for assistance. Their economy is still suffering.
The evil man scoffed. I couldn't care less about their economy. They should help themselves.
Well, they won't unless you tell them to, sire. For now, they're beating down the castle doors. Your fierceness will keep them in check.
Ganondorf sighed in annoyance. So be it. If you happen to squeeze any information from this Sheikah, send word immediately.
Of course, sire.
He turned to leave, but stopped. And Nabooru, if you allow her to escape, do not expect any mercy. Nabooru nodded once in assent, and Ganondorf left the room, slamming the door behind him. Zelda and Rovin watched him descend a staircase out of sight and mount a huge black steed, galloping off with two other Gerudo warriors at his side. Who was this Nabooru? She came at just the right moment and sent Ganondorf away, and shouldn't someone have come to arrest them by now? The guard had escaped minutes ago.
You may come in now,
Nabooru said. Zelda and Rovin exchanged glances. Was she speaking to them? She wasn't looking toward the window.
Don't worry, no one is after you.
She glanced at them, an eyebrow raised.
Come on now. The door's to your right, around the corner.
Hesitantly, they did as she said, entering the room where Impa's weak form sagged against the wall. She had fallen unconscious. Zelda rushed over to her, attempting to wake her, but she was out. She gazed up at Nabooru, who simply stood watching, and drew her weapon.
Who are you? And why did you send him away? Are you going to lock us in here? Because I will fight you with everything I have.
You don't need to speak to me through your Sheikah mask, princess. I already know who you are.
Of course she did. Rovin knelt next to Impa and began to pull at her chains. Are you on our side? He asked. Naburu was silent at first. Then she reached into a pocket and pulled out a key, handing it to Rovin.
I am on Hyrule's side,
she said. He took it and unlocked Impa's chains. She slumped onto the ground, but he gently broke her fall. Zelda stood, pulling her face wraps down.
How is it you know who I am?
Naburu smiled.
My good friend Suna. She told me all about you, your visit, and your mission.
Zelda's mouth fell open slightly.
I've been building a resistance against Ganondorf.
He thinks you're still loyal to him? Rovin asked, arranging Impa's limbs in a more comfortable manner.
He thinks I want power as much as he does. I am betrothed to him, after all.
Betrothed? To Ganondorf? Zelda couldn't help her disgusted expression. Naburu simply laughed.
Don't worry. I don't plan on actually wedding him.
She took on a more serious tone.
I plan on killing him. Then your mission is much like mine.
Zelda replied. She strode closer to the Gerudo.
What can you tell me? Nothing. For now, I'll help you get Impa out of here.
What will happen to you? Rovin asked. He said he'd show no mercy. Naburu smiled slyly.
I know how to manipulate him. I'll be fine.
She reached into another pocket and brought out a bottle of red liquid. Zelda recognized it as a healing potion. She wondered where she'd gotten it from, thinking of Granny.
Give this to her. It will wake her and you will be escorted out with no threat to you. Go home and do not return. Not yet. Steps need to be taken for my plan to coalesce, and I can't have anyone disrupting it. How long do you need? Zelda
asked, handing the bottle to Rovin, who gently coaxed Impa to drink it.
As long as possible.
Impa began to stir and embraced Zelda when she saw her.
What is going on? We'll explain everything on the way home,
Zelda replied, palming Impa's cheek, much like Impa would do.
You're safe now.
Naburu managed to get all three of them safely back to Kami in the valley, and even gave them one more horse to take with them. She stopped Zelda before she mounted, an intensity in her eyes.
That man murdered my friend. Suna was special. Not just because she was a sage, but because she was a good person. I will never forgive him, and I know you won't either. We will destroy him, princess. That I can promise you. But we must be patient. Please do not return for as long as you can. I promise. And should we expect any more raids from your people?
She had to ask, however awkward it might feel.
You will be safe. No one sends a raid unless Ganondorf or I condone it, and I will keep his mind distracted from such acts.
Zelda didn't want to know how Naburu would be doing that, but her demeanor, her confidence and decency, it all reminded her so much of Suna. A hint of trust was forming.
Thank you, Naburu, and good luck.
They leapt the horses over the broken bridge and galloped away towards safety. The more Zelda searched, the more she found she wasn't truly alone in her fight. There were people she could count on, and she hoped that would never change. Impa's homecoming felt magical. Countless souls hugged and welcomed her back, including Telma, of course, who crushed them all in a group embrace. But Zelda couldn't feel the full effect of it. Not after what Rauru had told her. She didn't know when Impa would be called to the Shadow Temple, but she would be. And Zelda still had to break the news. Knowing how was the trick. Vernia rushed up to Impa and kissed her unabashedly while the people laughed and looked on. This was unbearable. How was she to confess to Impa that everything she was so happy to return to would be taken from her. But before she could contemplate it more, Vernia turned to Zelda, her face set in a grave expression.
Sheik, I know how the Gerudo knew to come here.
She hesitated, nervously glancing from Zelda to Impa and to Rovin.
Vernia, tell us.
Impa said. She swallowed.
It was the stable girl. It was Milana.
Zelda gazed at Milana's defiant face. She sat on a bench in the town's only jail cell. Ironic that Zelda had maneuvered from one cell to another in a matter of days. But this cell was almost never used. Kageno was peaceful most of the time. She sat across from the stable girl and sighed. Then she pulled down her face wraps. Vernia had explained to Zelda her hunch that someone from the stables had something to do with the Gerudo's sudden attack. When the warriors arrived, they seemed to actively avoid the stables. She grew suspicious and looked into Milana's activities. She found a letter written in Gerudo script, which she had to translate. In it, the details were mapped out. Milana had somehow found out who Zelda really was. She had realized she was Hyrule's missing princess, one whom the Gerudo had been searching for all these years. Her envy of Sheik took a new form, and she wrote to treacherous warriors explaining that Zelda had been hiding out here. The Gerudo wrote back, naming terms, and pledged that in return for her information, Milana's horses would not be harmed. When they attacked, Milana remained out of sight and protected, while Kageno and its people were ravaged by vicious killers. Of course, Milana had no idea that Zelda would be leaving, and she panicked, trying to contact the Gerudo before they arrived. But it was too late. They came, and Impa was taken. A result Milana did not predict. This meant that Vernia now knew who Zelda was as well. Though Impa loved Vernia, she'd never revealed it to her. But the Sheikah elder was loyal, and hadn't said a word to anyone else about Zelda's identity, or the reason for Milana's betrayal. The only thing Zelda did not know was how. How had Milana discovered her secret? And she was here now to find out.
Here I am,
She said in her true voice. It felt odd, as Milana was someone Zelda would never have willingly revealed herself to. Not in a million years.
Now you have confirmation. I am indeed Princess Zelda of Hyrule. So tell me, Milana, did you hate me so much that my death would have made you satisfied?
The girl glared at her.
I didn't know if they would kill you.
She said rudely.
I just thought they might take you away. That evil king or whatever. I thought he might just throw you in a cell.
And yet it is you who has been thrown into a cell.
Milana clenched her jaw in anger.
Tell me how.
Zelda demanded.
How did you figure it out?
The girl huffed a sardonic laugh.
That kiss.
She said. Zelda's brows knitted together. She saw.
I was there, hiding behind some trees. I was watching you and Rovin sparring, hoping he'd get a good punch in. Then he started calling you Zelda and took your face wraps down.
She actually gazed at Zelda in a kind of awe.
Felt stupid. Stupid for missing the signs all these years. I love Rovin, and you've been keeping him on your hip all yourself. And I find out you ain't even you?
She spat at Zelda's feet.
It ain't fair. I wanted you gone.
Zelda shook her head sadly. She actually felt pity for Milana. Her jealousy had taken her down a dark path, one that had devastating consequences.
Impa was tortured by that evil king or whatever. Because of your choices. Because of your envy.
I didn't mean for that.
Oh yes, you did. You meant for terrible things to happen. And you got your wish.
She stood and moved to the door, but then turned back to Milana.
How could you do this, after what they did to your home all those years ago?
Milana looked away, a small bit of shame finally showing.
I knew what they were capable of, what they could do. To you.
Zelda sighed in resignation. There would be no reaching this misguided girl.
You are to leave Kageno in 2 days' time, and never return.
The girl's face dropped. She shook her head at the stable girl again.
No one will trust you now,
she said. Zelda left the cell, pledging that to be the last time she ever looked upon Milana's face. In the weeks since returning to Kageno with Impa, routine had returned as well for most of the residents. Homes were being rebuilt, children were going back to school, and life was resembling how it used to look. But not for Zelda. For her, Garen's absence was even more starkly noticed as the days drew on. She stayed far from his burnt-down shop and packed away the kunai blades he had gifted her, so she would not look upon them. She also had not yet confessed to Impa what she knew of her destiny, still sussing out how to approach it, unsure of the best way. As she and Rovin sat in the grotto on a cloudy morning, she decided to ask for his advice. This was not her normal way, and she felt awkward and silly, but Rovin had proven to be a true friend. She needed to trust him more, and wanted to bring him into her emotional orbit more often. But she refused to take advantage of him again. She would not allow herself to be selfish any longer. There was relief in explaining what she knew to him, and she was honest about how it made her feel.
She won't be able to have a family, Rovin. She won't be able to live her life, not the way she deserves to. I don't know how to tell her. It will bring her world crashing down.
Rovin frowned, his hazel eyes narrowed. He looked to be thinking something, but wouldn't say it.
What? Tell me your honest thoughts. I need help. You know how hard it is for me to admit that.
Zelda, I don't think you're fearing Impa's life crashing down.
You don't?
He shook his head. I think you're fearing your own. She shifted uncomfortably.
I don't know what you mean.
But she was lying. She did know. Rovin took her hand in his. I accepted it when you left on your journey, he said. That you and we'd never make this into something more. But now you've found your destiny. That you're a sage too. Which means...
I can't have a family either.
Her eyes filled with tears and she fell onto Rovin's shoulder. She sobbed out the emotions she'd been holding in since gaining all the knowledge she had. The knowing that her duty to Hyrule would overtake any hope for a personal future. It wasn't just Impa. It was both of them. Wherever you end up, Zelda, I'm going to come see you, Rovin said. She lifted her head to look at him.
How? What if I'm holed up in a temple? Somewhere you can't get to? What if I never see you or Impa or Telma again? When my mission is over, when I'm finished helping Link, I don't know what will happen to me.
I'll find a way, you know me. I'm not gonna give up. He gave her his classic goofy smile. And I know what's gonna happen to you. You're gonna do amazing things. You're gonna be the person I look up to. Like you always have been. Zelda's tears continued to fall, but the sad ones mixed with happy. She hugged her friend, the truest friend she'd ever known, she realized, and thanked the goddesses for him. Zelda sat across from Impa in the empty dining room, her expression apprehensive. What was she going to say? Would she say anything? There was no reaction thus far, just a passive indifference. Zelda grew more and more nervous the longer the silent seconds drew by.
Impa,
She said.
are you alright? You can tell me.
Impa slowly let a smile spread across her face.
I am honored.
she said, true emotion filling her voice.
Thank you for telling me, Zelda. I could not think of a better way to find out.
The princess frowned in confusion.
You're okay with this? You do know what this means, don't you? Impa, you can't plan for a future. No family, no friends, no life. You'll be stuck in that treacherous shadow temple with no one but yourself to keep you company.
She knew the words she spoke were harsh, but Impa deserved the truth. That place was a literal torture chamber. Kage wanted to transform it, but was murdered before he could. Zelda feared that Impa's chance to do the same would also be stolen from her, along with her life. Impa only chuckled.
Princess, I understand what I'll be giving up, but I have a life now, and I am living it because of you. Because you saw fit to rescue me from the King of Evil. You have given me the life I have always dreamed of. And when my time comes, it comes. I will accept my duty to Hyrule, just as you have. Do you even realize how inspiring you are? What?
She didn't understand. How could Impa be so unconcerned?
I was so proud when you decided to seek your own training. Perhaps I did not show it to you, and that is my failing. But I am telling you now, I watched you grow into the most capable young girl. A girl who took on every challenge she could, who proved herself every day. You, have become worthy of being a sage at your young age of 15. Not only that, but of having possession of the Triforce of Wisdom.
Zelda gaped at her.
You have shown me how to be the best sage I could ever be. You are my role model, Zelda.
More tears. She couldn't take more tears, even if they were good ones. But fall they did. Impa took her hand from across the table.
Don't ever forget how special you are. You may think I've taught you a lot, or that Garon did, or even the sages you met. But Zelda, you have taught each and every one of us more than we could ever teach you. I don't know what to say.
She wiped her eyes and took a breath.
But there is more, Impa. Perhaps you should not be so inspired by me, because I'm fearful and selfish. You're right. I'm a sage too, which means I'll suffer the same fate, having to give all of myself to this duty and give up my life.
Impa narrowed her eyes in retrospection.
I wouldn't assume so much, Princess. What do you mean? You have a piece of the Triforce. That makes you different from the rest of the sages. And once Ganondorf is defeated, someone has to lead Hyrule, don't they?
Someone did have to lead Hyrule. She was the only member of the royal family left. The only one left to take the crown.
We shall see what happens to the both of us when the time comes. But for now, let us live the lives we have. Yes?
Zelda smiled hesitantly.
All right.
She agreed.
But in the meantime, how do you feel about training me again? More than you already have been, I mean.
Impa laughed.
It would be an honor to train you again. In fact...
She brought from her pocket a curious-looking tree nut.
This is a Deku nut. I found it on the ground in the Gerudo prison, and I want to teach you how to use it. To disappear.
The long road called to her. It had been 2.5 years since Zelda's last journey. Kami galloped as though time was running out. And well, one could say it was. But this time she had much more control over how things would play out. The goddess harp rested on her back, a place it had become accustomed to. They had a sort of relationship, she and the harp. They'd gotten to know each other well while she sought out the ancient sages, and they'd been bonded ever since. It had been through a bit of a ringer though, having been dropped and stepped on numerous times. off-white fabric wrapped around a fracture in the wood, a wound that would never heal. But the harp still played, and now, as she rode toward Hyrule one last time, she could feel its excitement. It was finally time. Link would be waking soon, and Sheik would be there to guide him. As she rode, her thoughts drifted to the past few days, the goodbyes she'd had. Rovin had been especially saddened, though he covered it up with humor. He had made her promise to use the compass if she needed to, though she didn't have the heart to tell him she wouldn't. Hyrule was as familiar to her as Kageno now was. Its map lived inside her mind, and she would have no trouble traversing it. But she promised him anyway, and he promised her again that he would visit once this was all over. She still wasn't entirely sure what would happen when the time came, but in the last few years, she and Rovin had grown their friendship into something a little more special. Undefined still, yes, but special. Telma, her skirts rustling and her bosom squishing Zelda into a fierce hug, made her promise to eat 3 full meals a day, even if she was tracking Link to the ends of the earth. And Impa? Well, Impa had given Zelda some advice. Advice the princess and sage had been contemplating for days now.
He will be lost.
Impa said to her.
Link will not know what to do with himself when he has done his duty. He will be a child trapped in a man's body, unable to reconcile the childhood he did not live through. How am I to help him?
Zelda had asked, because Impa was right. It was an unfair and terrible fate to face.
You must let him live it,
she had replied. Zelda had not understood that, not at first, but it began to make sense as she considered the words.
I cannot,
she had exclaimed.
Impa, I'll lose him.
Impa had taken Zelda's face in her hands with sympathy.
You'll lose him either way.
Now, as she thought about the consequences of sending Link back to his childhood with the Ocarina of Time, she shuddered. It would be her last step, and while Link would remember every single detail of whatever he was fated to go through, at least he would be able to live his lost childhood, to grow and mature into a true adult, to experience life as it was meant to be experienced. It would be the best possible outcome. Maybe not for her, but for him. Lake Hylia rose into view from behind the hills in front of her. As she had suspected, it had almost completely emptied now. She summoned every ounce of strength she possessed and pushed Kami into an even harder gallop, veering away from the lake and toward Hyrule Field. The Temple of Time, nestled in the outskirts of Castletown, was still wreathed in darkness, just like in the very first vision Rauru had sent her. She rode past the redeads littering the square, wondering who they had been in life, and then shut the thought out of her mind. She entered the temple, listening to the echo of her steps and gazing at the sparkling spiritual stones that still rested at the altar. Master Sword's empty pedestal stood, stoic as ever, as she entered the chamber, once a guarded secret now left open. She positioned herself behind it and waited. It took only minutes. A blue column of light suddenly rippled itself into view, and as it dissipated, an older Link, all dressed in green, and a fairy following him, stepped out of it, gripping the Master Sword in his left hand and glowing a determined aura. He stepped away, having not yet seen her.
I've been waiting for you,
she said quietly. He turned in surprise, his eyes as wide as they were when she saw him by the drawbridge all those years ago. The same boy looked out from those eyes, the same innocence, and she felt the distance between her and the boy in green grow.
Hero of Time,
she continued.
I am Sheik.
Epilogue. After the events of Ocarina of Time. The Queen of Hyrule sat the throne, while a resident of Kakariko Village informed her of an issue with the farm animals. Some were falling ill, mostly the sheep, and some of the cuckoos. No humans were affected, however, which puzzled the farmer, and so he could not come up with a solution. They discussed at length a potential resolution while her castle guards looked on. Once the man was satisfied, he left with a bow, thanking Queen Zelda for her enduring empathy. 3 months had passed since she had helped Link seal Ganondorf into the Sacred Realm, where he would sleep indefinitely, unable to cause chaos in their world any longer. Link hadn't wanted to go back to his childhood, and in all honesty, she almost granted him that wish. But her conscience won out. She explained that she had made a mistake all those years ago bringing Link into this whole mess, that every decision she had made since then had been to ensure he would remain safe and able to claim his fate. And once he did, she had to make things right. In the end, he relented, and he gave her the Ocarina of Time, an instrument which she hadn't held in so very long, and she had sent him home. Since that destined day, her future, which for her entire life she was certain was destined to be sad and lonely without Link in it, had turned out not to be so terrible. Rauru had sent her one last vision, ensuring her that she could take the crown and rule her land of Hyrule without fear of being shut behind a shadowy door. She had slowly recruited talent for her queen's court, including soldiers to again guard the sprawling castle. She had made allies with every race, including the Gerudo. She ensured that every single newly called sage had what they needed at all times. After everything she had seen and done, it was important to her, and every now and again she visited the Shadow Temple for a little training from Impa. Though she remained the only member of the royal family of Hyrule, it seemed that the path of shadow she had taken to get here had led her just a little closer to the light. "Queen Zelda," one of her soldiers said, interrupting her thoughts, which had kept her staring into space. "There is one more visitor, though not by appointment. Shall I send him in?"
Yes, Hyrule, please do.
She was determined to be a good queen, one that all of her subjects could depend on. If that meant staying up a little past her bedtime in order to take requests for help, she would do it. She shook out her tired limbs and sat tall on the throne. The doors opened, and Haro returned with,
Rovin!
Zelda leapt from her throne, forgetting all about decorum. She jumped into a hug and Rovin spun her around, her dress fanning out. She still hadn't quite gotten used to wearing gowns again. Sometimes she secretly wished she could wear her Sheik gear instead. She had learned to appreciate how well it had served her after all. What a change from the frightened little girl who felt only devastation at having to wear the getup. They separated, both smiling ear to ear. It was the first time she had seen him since she left to guide Link. She had sent a letter to him, ensuring that she was all right and free, and while she hadn't written it explicitly in the letter, she knew she was also free to be with anyone she wished. It was the only thought that could occur to her now, as she gazed into his hazel eyes full of mischief. Rovin moved a piece of her hair out of her face, and she flushed. She felt suddenly embarrassed, wishing for her face wraps to hide her, and wasn't sure what to say, so she let him speak first instead. He smiled at her, searching her eyes like he used to, and whispered, "There you are." The light in the Chamber of Sages, where Rauru not only guarded the Temple of Light, but also Ganondorf's beast form, a sleeping giant sealed away in a frozen jewel, seemed to shudder for a moment. The light here never did that. Not unless something had infiltrated the realm. Show yourself, he said to the air, knowing that it was not just air that now took up the space. A white light burst into view, a light only a goddess could emit. Once Rauru could adjust his eyes, he gazed at the pure, indescribable beauty of the goddess Hylia, a radiant being made of light. She had only ever visited this temple once before, and that was when Rauru was given his task of setting the princess and the hero on their paths. But back then, she had only spoken to him and had not shown herself. He had seen nothing like this before. She surpassed the beauty of the Temple of Light itself. He bowed in reverence. "It is my honor to witness your power, Goddess Hylia."
You have done well, Sage of Light, to honor my wishes. The princess sits the throne, and the hero walks a path in a different time, one separate from our own, a line of time that branched away. This is the destiny that shall shape the future worlds.
"There are branches of time?" Rauru asked. This was new information.
Indeed, timelines that go their own way and create new possibilities. It is necessary, for this, Hyrule, is not long for this world. You have seen to it.
For the first time, wisest Rauru, Sage of Light, felt confusion fill him up. "Please explain, Goddess Hylia. I have simply performed as you asked me. Was I not saving Hyrule?"
Hyrule was always meant to drown.
Hylia said.
It is the only destiny it had, until you set the princess on her path. This has made it possible for these lands to endure in another time, on another branch.
"But not here?" he asked. He felt a sting inside his chest, a sorrow he had only ever felt once before, when the ancient sages, his friends and companions, had been murdered.
It is the destiny of this land, and in order for it to come to pass, you must perform one last task.
He waited, a sinking feeling growing inside him.
In 100 years, you must release the King of Evil into the world again.